The bride was sent to the wrong ranch, until the rancher's little girl clung to her and whispered, "Stay." The Montana Territory in the winter of 1869 was not a land for the faint of heart. The wind cut across the plains like sharpened blades, piling snow into drifts so high that the horizon disappeared in a white haze. Miles from the nearest town, and the country seemed untouched by time, silent, unrelenting, and cruel. And yet, through that silence trudged a woman with a wool shawl drawn tight to her throat boots, sinking into the frozen crust. Her name was Clara Whitfield. She had traveled from Missouri under the assurances of a letter from the matrimonial agency, a letter that promised her the security of marriage to a rancher named Carter. A new life, they had said, a chance to leave the shame of her past behind. Each mile of stagecoach and sleigh had been paid with trembling hope. But as she reached the shadow of the ranch that loomed dark against the blizzard, her hands shook with something closer to fear. The door opened before she had the courage to knock. A man filled the frame, tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes slate gray and cold as the wind itself. His coat hung open just enough for her to glimpse a revolver at his hip, and on his left hand glinted a gold wedding band. His face bore the look of a man who had carried grief for too many years, and Clara felt the chill of his stare pierce her deeper than the storm. "I'm Clara Whitfield," she said quickly, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I was sent here by the Missouri Matrimonial Agency. I am to marry a Mr. Carter. This is Red Bluff Ranch, is it not?" The man blinked once, jaw tightening. "It is," he said flatly, "but there's no Carter here. My name is Jack Callahan, and I never ordered a bride." The words fell like stones between them. Clara's breath hitched her entire journey, collapsing into one cold truth. A mistake, an unforgivable mistake. The wind shoved against her back as if to push her away, but she stood firm. "There must be some error," she whispered. "Please, sir. The last coach has gone back to Fort Banner and the storm's worsening. I have nowhere else to go." Jack hesitated. His hand gripped the doorframe as though he would slam it shut and let the snow swallow her whole. Then, with a short exhale, he stepped aside. "One night," he said, "no more." Clara nearly wept from relief. She pulled her small trunk across the threshold, and warmth wrapped around her like a memory. The ranch house smelled of wood smoke and old pine. Its stone fireplace crackled, but the room itself was heavy with silence. Rough-hewn furniture stood where it had been placed years ago. A man's rifle rested by the door. A child's bonnet hung beside it. On the mantel stood a woman's portrait, half dusted but untouched, her unsmiling gaze frozen in time. My wife Jack said stiffly, noticing her glance, "She passed 3 years ago." Clara lowered her eyes. "I did not come to replace anyone," she murmured. I have nowhere else to be." Jack offered no reply. He simply gestured down the hall. "There's a spare room. You can sleep there tonight. In the morning, I'll take you back to town." Exhaustion pulled at Clara's bones, and she had no strength to argue. She nodded, clutching her shawl tighter. But before she could take another step, a sound interrupted the silence. Soft footsteps. Out of the shadows came a small figure, a girl no older than 5, barefoot in a faded blue nightdress. Her hair tumbled in unbrushed waves, her face pale against the firelight. She did not look at her father. Instead, she walked straight toward Clara. For a moment, the room was so still, Clara could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Tiny fingers reached out and clutched the edge of her skirt. A voice, fragile and breathless, broke the silence. "God finally sent you to us." Clara froze. Her throat tightened as she looked down at the child, Ellie Callahan. Her wide eyes brimmed with something desperate, something raw. Jack staggered forward a step, his face stricken. "Ellie," he breathed, dropping to his knees. His voice trembled, his hands half extended but too afraid to touch her. "You spoke." Clara looked from father to daughter, her heart cracking with the weight of the moment. She knelt gently, brushing a strand of hair from Ellie's face. "Hello, sweetheart. My name is Clara." The little girl's lips trembled. "Are you going to leave too?" Tears burned behind Clara's eyes. She cupped the child's cheek and whispered, "Not tonight." Jack stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. For 3 years, his daughter had lived in silence, and now, in the presence of a stranger, her voice had returned. The fire-popped snow hissed against the window, and the storm raged outside. But inside, something had shifted, delicate and unexplainable. Jack's voice for the first time softened. "Stay, at least until the storm passes." Clara met his eyes. Behind the hardness lay something wounded, something waiting. She nodded once, but deep down she knew the storm had already come, and she was already inside it. The storm did not pass quickly. Instead, it settled heavy over the Montana plains, sealing roads, burying fences, and locking the Callahan Ranch in white silence. Days bled together as wind rattled the windows and the fire became their lifeline. Clara found herself suspended in a strange in-between place, neither a guest nor truly belonging, yet unable to leave. Jack kept his distance. He spoke in clipped sentences, never wasting a word more than necessary. But Clara began to notice the small things, subtle gestures that said what his voice would not. Each morning, before she rose, fresh logs had been stacked by the hearth. When a draft slipped through the cracks in the wall of her room, she returned to find the boards newly nailed. One evening, after she nearly scalded herself trying to pour tea, the kettle handle was repaired by the next morning, its crack carefully soldered. He never admitted to these tasks, never looked for thanks. He moved about the house like a man maintaining a fortress, his every action precise, silent, unclaimed. Clara understood these were not kindnesses for her sake alone. They were rituals of survival, small repairs in a house where time had stood still for years. Ellie, meanwhile, drifted closer with each passing day. At first, the little girl lingered at the edge of the room, silent except for the single phrase she had spoken that first night. She followed Clara's movements with wide eyes, always clutching a rag doll with mismatched buttons. Then came the small offerings. One afternoon, Clara found a folded piece of paper placed beside her mending basket. When she opened it, she discovered a drawing of 3 stick figures beneath a bright yellow sun. One tall man, one woman with golden hair, and a small girl holding both their hands. Above them, scrawled in uneven letters, was a single word, Mama. Clara pressed the paper to her chest, her throat tight. Later that week, Ellie shuffled into the kitchen carrying a crooked plate of biscuits half burned and lopsided. The smell of flour and smoke filled the room. Clara sat down at the table and ate each one with deliberate care, praising them as though they were a feast fit for royalty. Ellie smiled, then, small, hesitant, but real. It was the first time Clara had seen light touch her face. Jack noticed, though he said nothing. Clara could feel his eyes lingering in those moments when Ellie laughed or clung to her sleeve. She caught him watching from the doorway, his features softening almost imperceptibly. He did not interfere, but he did not stop it either. It was as though he feared this fragile connection might break if he spoke too loud. One night, after Ellie had gone to bed, Clara sat near the fire, staring into the embers. Jack remained at the window, arms crossed the storm, groaning outside. The silence pressed thick between them until Jack said, without turning, "I found a letter in your trunk." Clara's body went rigid. She had forgotten about the letter from the doctor, the one she had tucked beneath her shawl weeks before leaving Missouri. "You read it?" she asked, her voice tight. Jack's shoulders shifted. "I didn't mean to pry, but yes." Shame and fear crashed over her. She gripped the shawl at her chest, unable to meet his eyes. "Then you know," she whispered, "I will never bear children." For the first time since she had arrived, Jack crossed the room to sit across from her. His gray eyes studied her face, not with pity, but with a steadiness that unsettled her. "You saved lives during the war," he said quietly. "That wound may have taken something from you, but it doesn't diminish who you are." Clara blinked, surprised. She had expected rejection, perhaps even contempt. Instead, his words carried a kind of respect she had not heard in years. "There are scars a man can see," Jack continued, "and scars that stay hidden. You've carried both and survived. That's more than most could ever claim." Clara turned away, tears glistening at the edges of her eyes. "I don't want your sympathy." "You don't have it," he said firmly. "Only my respect." The silence that followed was no longer suffocating. It was something else, something alive, fragile, and human. For the first time, Clara felt she was not standing on the edge of someone else's life, but being seen as part of it. Ellie's presence made the shift even more undeniable. She began humming as she played with her doll tiny tunes that Clara realized had once been lullabies. Clara found an old Bible on the shelf and began reading to Ellie in the afternoons. The child leaned against her, her small fingers twisting the edge of Clara's sleeve as if tethering herself to safety. Jack would stand in the doorway during those readings, arms folded, face unreadable. Yet each day, Clara noticed the weight in his shoulders easing, the hard line of his jaw softening. The house, though still steeped in silence, no longer felt like a tomb. Something was beginning to thaw, fragile as ice in spring, but beneath every tender moment a shadow lingered. Ellie's silence had returned after that first miraculous whisper, and Clara noticed the way her drawing sometimes grew darker. Jagged lines, looming figures, crooked words. There were wounds in this house that love alone could not mend. Not yet. Clara folded one such drawing into her lap one evening, a small child clutching the skirt of a woman, a shadow towering behind them. The firelight flickered across her trembling hands. She looked up at Jack, his face half lit in orange glow. "Jack," she said softly, "what really happened the night your wife disappeared?" His eyes darkened, his jaw clenched, and the storm outside seemed to press harder against the glass. Jack did not answer at first. He sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire, as if the flames might tell him what words could not. The silence dragged long enough that Clara feared she had trespassed too far. Then, in a low voice, almost reluctant, he began. "I was drunk that night," he said. "Drunk enough that I don't remember what the argument was about. My wife, Martha, took Ellie upstairs. I stayed by the fire, bottle in hand. When I woke the next morning..." His words caught. He rubbed his temples, forcing the confession out. "There was blood on my shirt, blood on the floorboards near the back door. Her coat was gone, and she was gone." Clara sat still, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "You never found her." Jack shook his head. "No note, no body. The sheriff came my cousin, James Callahan. He ruled it a disappearance. Some said she ran off, couldn't handle the loneliness. Others weren't so sure. I've prayed for dreams, for flashes, anything that might tell me if I hurt her. But there's nothing. Just the hangover and that blood. Clara's throat ached at the torment in his voice. Do you believe you harmed her? His jaw worked clenching and unclenching. I don't know, he said finally, his voice hoarse, and not knowing is worse than any answer. The fire cracked sharply. Clara felt the weight of his torment settle between them, heavy and suffocating. But then she remembered Ellie's drawings, the frantic shadows, the crooked words the little figure scrawled beside pools of red. The child had seen something remembered, something even if no one had asked her to speak of it. The next day, when Jack took the wagon out to mend a section of fence, Clara wrapped her cloak tightly and set out across the ridge. The storm had eased, leaving drifts high against the fences and bare branches rattling in the brittle air. Her boots crunched over the crusted snow until she reached a weathered cabin tucked at the edge of the woods. The door creaked open before she could knock. A woman stood in the frame, thin, wrapped in a shawl, patched with years of mending, one eye cloudy with blindness, and a long scar carving down the side of her neck. Mrs. Hargrove, the widow neighbors had spoken of. "You're Jack Callahan's woman, are you?" the old woman asked, her voice dry as pine bark. Clara hesitated. "I'm staying at his ranch," she said carefully, "and I have questions." The widow gave a short laugh. "Don't we all?" Inside the cabin smelled of smoke and herbs. Clara explained everything she knew, Ellie's drawings, the blood, Jack's missing memory. Mrs. Hargrove listened without interrupting, her good eye sharp, her scar twitching slightly when she frowned. At last the woman sighed. "That night," she said, "I heard something. A scream, faint but sharp around midnight. My husband had already passed, and I don't go looking for trouble in the dark. But the next morning I found footprints in the snow leading down from the Callahan place." Clara leaned forward. One set. Two, Mrs. Hargrove corrected, her voice grim. But only one came back. A chill swept through Clara deeper than the wind. "You told the sheriff." The old woman barked a humorless laugh. Sheriff was Jack's kin. James Callahan didn't want scandal dogging the family. Told me to hold my tongue, so I did. But I always figured that boy deserved the truth even if he was too broken to look for it. Clara stood in the doorway afterward, her mind reeling. Footprints, a scream, a cover-up by the sheriff himself, and a child who remembered more than anyone dared to believe. When she returned to the ranch, Ellie was waiting by the window, a drawing clutched in her small hand. This one was different, darker, more frantic. A small woman with arms outstretched. Beside her, a tall figure dragging her away, blood smeared across the page. And at the bottom, clumsy letters, "Pa is sleep." Clara's heart clenched. She gathered Ellie into her arms and whispered, "You're safe, sweetheart. I believe you." The child pressed her face against Clara's shoulder, silent but trembling with relief. That night, Jack noticed the drawing on the table. His face drained of color as he studied the jagged lines. "She remembers," he murmured almost to himself. Clara met his eyes across the lamplight. "Then maybe it's time you stopped blaming yourself." Jack's gaze lingered on her, searching, but he gave no answer. He simply set the paper down and walked away, his shoulders burdened by the weight of memory he still could not reconcile. But Clara knew the truth was no longer buried. The storm outside had begun to thaw, but inside the Callahan home a different storm was building, one that would force them to confront what had really happened, no matter how painful the answers might be. The thaw inside the Callahan house was fragile but real. Each day, Ellie grew bolder, smiling when Clara read to her, humming softly when she stitched small patterns into scraps of cloth. Jack, though still reserved, allowed himself the smallest signs of peace. He took Ellie outside one pale gray afternoon, lifting her carefully onto the back of a chestnut mare. Clara watched from the fence as Jack guided the horse in a slow circle, his hand steady on Ellie's back. Each time the girl passed by, she waved her grin breaking wide across a face that had known too much silence. "She trusts you," Clara said when they returned, brushing snow from her gloves. Jack helped Ellie down, dusting snow from her cap. His eyes lingered on Clara's face for a beat longer than usual. "I guess she knows when someone's worth trusting." The words settled between them like an ember refusing to die out. That night, as the wind rose into a shrieking blizzard, Clara stepped outside for a forgotten bucket. She wore only her shawl and a thin scarf, the cold lashing her skin like a whip. Before she could retreat inside, Jack appeared behind her. Without a word, he draped his heavy coat over her shoulders, pulling the collar close against her neck. His breath steamed between them, close enough that she felt its warmth on her cheek. "You'll freeze like that," he murmured. Clara's heart pounded. His gray eyes weren't cold anymore. They were tired, yes, but softer open in a way she had not seen before. "Thank you," she whispered. Inside, the fire painted the walls gold. Ellie was asleep in the rocking chair, her doll resting against her chest. Jack stood near the hearth, his voice low. "Martha, my wife. I met her at a fair. She wore blue, always blue. She used to laugh at the way I walked in boots, said I looked like a stiff ox." His smile flickered, faded. He lifted his left hand, showing the ring. "I still wear this, because I'm afraid if I take it off, I'll forget the sound of her voice." Clara's hand rose slowly, resting over his chest above his heartbeat. "Maybe she wants you to remember something else now," she said softly. "Not just her voice, but how much she loved you and how much you still have left to give." Jack swallowed hard. His hand hovered just beneath hers, not touching, but near. "I don't know how." "You do," she replied. "You already are." For a long moment they stood close, the storm screaming beyond the walls, while the warmth between them held steady. Clara no longer felt like a guest in this house. She felt like she had been expected somehow all along. But peace, she discovered, rarely comes without a test. The next afternoon, as Jack tended the horses beyond the southern fence, a rider appeared at the ranch. Clara stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes from the pale sun. The man dismounted slowly, dust clinging to his coat, his boots dragging with fatigue. But when he lifted his hat, Clara's stomach turned. His face was weathered, his jaw set hard, and his eyes glinted like rusted nails. "Name's Danner," he said, his voice even. "Used to work this place a few years back. Heard Jack Callahan still lives here." Clara nodded stiffly, every instinct screaming danger. At her side, Ellie had slipped onto the porch, her small hand wrapping around Clara's. The moment the child saw the man, she froze. Her eyes widened in terror, then she spun and bolted inside without a word. Clara's blood ran cold. She directed Danner toward the southern fence, watching him ride away, then hurried inside. She found Ellie curled beneath the guest room bed, shaking violently, clutching a piece of charcoal. With frantic strokes, the girl drew directly onto the floorboards. A woman, a child, a man with a blade and blood. Clara's breath caught. She ran to the fireplace, reaching for Jack's rifle mounted above the mantel. But before her hands closed around it, the door slammed open. Danner stood in the frame, his eyes cold. "She remembers, doesn't she?" he said calmly. Clara's chest tightened. "You killed her," she accused, her voice sharp. His mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She wasn't supposed to be there. Neither was the kid. But your man, Jack? He was too deep in drink to notice. Couldn't let her talk now, could I?" His hand moved, drawing a knife from beneath his coat. Clara darted for the rifle again, but he was faster. He lunged, knocking it aside so it clattered across the floor. His hand clamped around her arm, shoving her back. Pain seared through her shoulder as she stumbled. He raised the knife, eyes gleaming. A scream tore from Clara's lips as she struggled. Then another sound split the air, Ellie shrieking in terror, rushing from the hallway. No, Clara twisted, throwing herself between Danner and the child. The knife plunged, slashing deep across her side. She collapsed, blood blooming scarlet against her bodice. Clara Jack's voice thundered from the doorway. The crack of his rifle split the air. Danner jerked, staggering back, clutching his side as he fell. Jack stormed forward, face dark with fury. He kicked the knife aside and dropped to his knees beside Clara. Blood pooled beneath her hot and fast. "Stay with me," he begged hoarsely, his hands pressing against the wound. Ellie crawled to Clara's side, sobbing. "Mama," she screamed. "Mama, don't go." Jack froze at the word. Tears filled his eyes as he looked down at his daughter clutching Clara's arm, her voice breaking open after years of silence. Neighbors, drawn by the gunshot, soon arrived. Among them, a former deputy recognized Danner instantly. With Ellie's trembling testimony and the neighbors' recollections of a scream years ago, the truth unraveled swiftly. Danner had murdered Martha Callahan and hidden the crime while Jack drank himself into torment. He was taken away in shackles, his face twisted with defeat, but none of it mattered more than the fever that followed. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, her skin pale as snow, her breaths shallow. Jack never left her side. Through long nights, he mopped her brow, whispered her name, and begged her to fight. Ellie, small and determined, crept into the room each morning, climbing onto the bed to press damp cloths against Clara's forehead as though mimicking her father's devotion. One night, as the fever finally broke, Clara stirred. Her eyes fluttered open to find Jack's hand gripping hers tightly. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice faint. "I should never have let you get hurt," he choked. She smiled weakly. Worth it, for her. Ellie, listening from the doorway, tiptoed in. She laid her tiny hand across Clara's arm, her voice fragile but steady. "She's my mama now." Jack bowed his head, broken and breathless, unable to deny the truth that had been spoken aloud. He pressed his lips to Clara's hand and whispered, "You saved us both." Winter had begun to soften around the edges, but inside Clara Whitfield carried a storm of her own. Her wound healed slowly, leaving a scar that burned when she bent to lift anything heavy. More painful than the ache in her side was the ache in her heart, the unshakable belief that she could not remain. Jack had stood by her night and day through her fever. Ellie clung to her, constantly calling her mama, with a certainty that pierced Clara's soul. But in the quiet hours, Clara's thoughts circled back to the letter from her doctor, the words carved into her like a cruel prophecy. Minimal to no chance of bearing children. Jack deserved more than her broken body. Ellie deserved a future secure with a mother who could give her brothers and sisters a family larger than 3 lonely hearts patched together. At least that was what Clara told herself as she sat at the kitchen table one morning, pen trembling in her hand. "Dear Jack," she wrote, "you have given me a warmth I thought I'd never feel again. But I am not whole. I cannot bear children, and you deserve more than what I can offer. Please know that I love you and Ellie with all that I am. But love is not always enough." She folded the note carefully and placed it beneath the photograph of Martha on the mantel. Then she turned to pack her small trunk. Upstairs, Ellie stirred from her nap. She padded downstairs and her socks doll clutched close. The house was quiet, too quiet. That was when she saw the letter, her name scrawled in the second paragraph beneath the words, "I cannot be her mother." The child's small chest heaved. She did not cry. Instead, she turned, pulled on her boots and scarf, and slipped silently out the front door into the snow. By the time Clara discovered the empty bed and the door ajar, panic had taken hold. "Jack!" she screamed, racing through the house, her voice wild with guilt. "She's gone." Jack had just returned from the barn. He dropped the saddle into the snow. "What do you mean she's gone?" She read the letter. Clara gasped. "She thinks I'm leaving because of her." Jack didn't hesitate. He pulled the chestnut mare into the yard, saddled her with practiced speed, and hauled Clara onto the horse behind him. Together, they rode into the storm snow, stinging their faces, wind howling like wolves across the valley. Ellie Jack's voice cracked as he shouted into the night. "Ellie, come back." Hours blurred as they scoured the riverbed and tree line. Their throats were raw from calling when Clara spotted a flash of blue fabric between the pines. Jack leapt from the horse before it stopped moving. There, curled beneath a gnarled tree, lay Ellie, her arms wrapped around her doll, her cheeks pale as ice, her eyes fluttering open weakly. Baby Clara choked, falling to her knees. "What have you done?" Ellie's lips trembled. "You don't want me anymore." Clara gathered her into shaking arms, pressing her forehead to the child's. "No, no, sweetheart. I was never leaving you. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong." Jack knelt beside them, wrapping his coat around both mother and child, his own hands trembling. "Don't you ever run from us again," he said, voice breaking. "You're our little girl. Nothing changes that." Ellie's arms wound tight around Clara's neck. "I want you to be my mama forever," she whispered. Tears streamed down Clara's face. "Then I will be," she promised, holding her tighter. "Forever, if you'll have me." Jack's hand closed over Clara's, his eyes full of a wordless vow. In that frozen clearing with the past finally behind them, a broken family was made whole again. The storm passed with the dawn. The world lay blanketed in clean snow, the air sharp but still. Inside the house, the fire crackled and soup simmered on the stove. Ellie curled between Clara and Jack beneath a quilt, her small fingers entwined with Clara's, refusing to let go. After breakfast, Jack asked them both to walk with him. The three of them stepped into the glittering white world together. At the creek, Jack stopped and turned his expression unreadable. He pulled a small velvet pouch from his coat. Inside lay a ring, simple and worn. "I wore this too long," he said, holding up his left hand. Slowly, he slid off the gold band of his first marriage. "She's gone. I loved her, but loving her doesn't mean I stop living. Clara Emmy needs a mother, and I need you." Clara's eyes blurred with tears. "Family isn't about where we come from," Jack continued. "It's about where we choose to stay." Then, before the snow-bright creek, he dropped to one knee. "I choose you, Clara Whitfield. Will you marry me?" Ellie tugged at Clara's sleeve, her eyes shining. Clara knelt, wrapping her arms around the child before reaching for Jack's hand. "Yes," she whispered through tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, his wife's ring once now carrying a new promise. A week later, the church in Fort Banner opened its doors to a quiet wedding. The pews filled with townsfolk who had heard the tale, the stranger who bled to protect a child, the widower who found peace where he least expected, the little girl who had found her voice again. Wildflowers lined the aisle. Jack stood at the altar, visibly nervous in his best shirt. Then the doors opened and Clara entered in a borrowed gown, her hair pinned with lavender. Ellie walked proudly ahead in her blue dress, scattering petals. When the preacher asked who gave the bride away, Ellie's voice rang out, "I do." Laughter and tears filled the room. After the vows, after the kiss, Ellie threw her arms around them both. The three walked out into the sunlight together, no longer bound by grief, but joined by grace. That night, as Ellie slept peacefully between them, Clara whispered into the quiet, "I wasn't born to be a mother, but I was called to become one." Life rarely gives us the family we imagine. Sometimes it gives us something harder. Broken hearts, grief too heavy to carry, silence that lingers for years. But family isn't written only in blood. It is chosen in the moments when we stay, when we fight, when we refuse to walk away, even when it would be easier. Clara, Jack, and Ellie learned that love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up scarred and trembling and daring to believe that healing is possible. If their story has touched you, if you've felt the cold of the Montana snow, the warmth of a fire after loss, or the fragile strength of a little girl's voice returning, then you understand the truth: family is not found. It is made. What do you think makes a family whole? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West love stories that remind us, even in a land of storms and silence, love always finds a way.